I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Now that we have reviewed the actual text of Doctrine and Covenants 132, that's the polygamy revelation, let's discuss the context. Now, a lot can be said and much more has been written about Nauvoo polygamy. Some historians have made it their sole purpose to document and understand everything that happened when it came to Mormon elites practicing polygamy throughout the first half of the 1840s. It's a controversial subject. A few historians have tried to make the case that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy, and that it was just his Mormon elite cohorts who were practicing spiritual wifery. But that's nonsense, which requires ignoring dozens of first-hand contemporary sources which corroborate polygamy by Joseph Smith and his closest acolytes. As far as historians can tell, it happened. So the question is, what did it look like? How was it practiced? What was the text that it was based on, which we read last week? What were the reactions of people when the doctrine was revealed to them? We've explored some of these questions as the topic of polygamy has come up in our timeline from time to time. And, it's just not a simple subject, and the idea of sharing spouses was so incredibly contrary to the Victorian Protestant ideals of, the kind of standard model of a nuclear family, one husband, one wife. Because of that, polygamy required persuasion, coercion, and, upon acceptance, the utmost secrecy, which was repeatedly built into the text of 132 itself. The practice of polygamy had commenced years before the actual text of D&C 132 was dictated. It required verbal communication of the idea and the scriptural justification of it to those who would be initiated, but having an actual paper revelation which could be presented certainly helped to elevate the practice, thus legitimizing any proposal that Mormon elite men would propose. The trade-off, however, was that there now existed a paper trail, removing any chance of plausible deniability. The existence of a paper revelation on polygamy factored heavily into the criticisms raised by the Nauvoo expositor, which led to Joe and Hiram's deaths less than a year after the revelation being dictated. So for today, I'm going to be relying heavily on some of the foremost historians of polygamy. Now, polygamy falls outside of any field of knowledge that I really have, and frankly, it falls outside my specific field of interest, which is why we've spent comparatively little time on it with respect to, political and military and criminal aspects of Nauvoo Mormonism. So, polygamy, it was an ever-present cloud hanging over Nauvoo, and the practice of it influenced many decisions. It's an important piece to the Nauvoo Mormon history puzzle, but as a standalone subject, it's a theological issue which just doesn't particularly interest me that much. That's not to denigrate polygamy's importance, only to reveal personal preferences, right? If polygamy as a standalone subject interests you, I'd recommend listening to the Year of Polygamy podcast if you haven't listened to it already. If you listen to that in conjunction with this show, your understanding of polygamy and how it impacted Nauvoo Mormonism will be much more complete and richer. Besides, Year of Polygamy is one of the best Mormon history podcasts out there and spectacularly well done. So with that said, let's get into the historical context of the revelation and practice. By July of 1843, Joe had somewhere around 24 wives, most of which were probably unknown to Emma, first spouse of Joe of over 15 years by this point. The portion of the text from Doctrine and Covenants 132 we discussed last week will be coming into focus today, and that's the verses I'm going to read here, verse 51 and 52, quote, "Verily I say unto you, a commandment I give unto mine handmaid, Emma Smith, your wife, whom I have given unto you, that she stay herself, and partake not of that which I commanded you to offer unto her. For I did it, saith the Lord, to prove you all as I did Abraham, and that I might require an offering at your hand by covenant and sacrifice. Partake not of that which I commanded you to offer unto her." We're going to get into it in a second. Verse 52. "And let mine handmaid, Emma Smith, receive all those who have been given unto my servant Joseph, and who are virtuous and pure before me. And those who are not pure, and have said they were pure, shall be destroyed, saith the Lord God." End quote. Now, verse 54 is where it commands Emma to, quote, abide and cleave unto my servant Joseph and to none else, end quote. So let's get into this. What does it mean? The presence of these passages has caused some discord among historians with how to interpret the historical record. Now, there may be evidence that a deal was brokered between Joe and Emma on quote-unquote equal rights, that she may have agreed to that Joe could have wives if she could take another husband. Now, no documentation exists that would unquestionably verify this, at least none that historians have access to, just old reminiscences of people. This possible equal rights, quote-unquote, deal has to do with Emma and a guy named William Law, who is in and of himself a controversial figure of Nauvoo Mormonism, especially given his role as one of the primary publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor, which, once again, I'll refresh, led to Joe and Hiram's deaths, right? So a contemporary source for this possible polyandry deal between Joe and Emma comes from William Clayton. William Clayton was Joe's primary scribe in Nauvoo, so his journal entry for the 23rd of June, 1843 says this, quote, this a.m., President Joseph took me and conversed considerable concerning some delicate matters. Said Emma wanted to lay a snare for me meaning Joe. He told me last night of this and said he had felt troubled. He said Emma had treated him coldly and badly since I came, and he knew she was disposed to be revenged on him for some things. She thought that if he would indulge himself, she would too. End quote. If Joe would indulge himself, she would too. For further detail on this possible deal between Joseph and Emma, we must turn to the Joseph H. Jackson expose of 1844 after Joe and Hiram's deaths. Now, remember, Joseph H. Jackson was the guy who joined the Mormons under false pretenses to expose Joe Smith and the deluded religious sect. So he had gained Joe's favor, and Joe called on Jackson to carry out a mission in Missouri to break Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell out of prison and to finish off the botched Lilburn Boggs assassination, neither of which he was able to accomplish because, well, he was an idiot. Jackson's expose it's really controversial and divisive among Mormon historians, but this is what he tells of the situation between Joe and Emma Smith, and of course William and Jane Law. Now, this is a bit of a long read, but it's so full of goodies that we're going to deal with here. So here it goes, quote, it was shortly after the adventure I have related above that Joe informed me in conversation that he had been endeavoring for some 2 months to get Mrs. William Law, Jane Law, for a spiritual wife. He said he had used every argument in his power to convince her of the correctness of his doctrine, but could not succeed. I then asked him how he dare preach such doctrines to virtuous and well-meaning females in the name of the Lord, and in relation to the particular course he was pursuing towards Mrs. Law. I remarked that it astonished me to see him profess so great friendship for Law, while at the same time he was endeavoring to destroy his happiness by the seduction of his wife. To this he replied that Law was trying to seduce Emma, and he was determined to beat him. I then asked him if Emma knew of his having so many spiritual wives, to which he replied that she did, and was knowing to every act of his life, and he believed she was the most virtuous woman on earth, and that she even would not be true to him if she could get a chance. But, said he, I watch her close and mean to, so long as I live. I then asked him if he could blame Law if he should seduce Emma. He seemed to think that Law would not do such a thing. I then reminded that he had just said that Law had tried to seduce Emma in order to justify his own proceedings with Law's wife, but that now he contradicted himself by expressing so much confidence in Law. So, to propose the situation not in cryptic language the way that Joseph Jackson is reporting it here, basically, Joe was telling Jackson that William Law was trying to seduce Emma, and that he was using that as justification to go after William Law's wife, Jane Law, right? So then he's pointing out a contradiction here. So you think that she's the most virtuous woman on earth. She would not be true to you if she could get a chance. That's what, Jackson is asking of Joseph Smith. If you think that she's so virtuous, but she would not be true to you if if William Law gave her a chance, then he points out this contradiction. And then he says, He seemed to think that Law would not do such a thing. I then reminded him that he had just said that Law tried to seduce Emma in order to justify his own proceedings with Law's wife. So now, this is Joe's response. To get out of this dilemma, he said that the truth was Emma wanted Law for a spiritual husband, and that she urged as a reason that as he had so many spiritual wives, she thought it but fair that she should at least have one man spiritually sealed up to her, and that she wanted Law because he was such a sweet little man. Now, sweet little man is in quotes there, as if it's directly quoting Emma. He then tried to persuade me to aid him in his purposes on Mrs. Law, and said that he would employ any stratagem in order to accomplish his object, and went on to say that he and Emma had both tried to persuade her of the correctness of the doctrine, but that she would not believe it to be of God. I told him that he must carry out his plot himself, for I would have nothing to do with such things. But he remarked that if all parties were agreed, that he and Law had better swap wives, to which he replied that that was all Emma wanted, end quote. So that's the Jackson account of this, quote-unquote wife-swapping ring that was going on between, William Law, Joseph Smith, and then Emma Smith and Jane Law, right? But it wasn't long after this reported occurrence that William Law was excommunicated from the church. He formed his own branch of the church in Nauvoo, published the Nauvoo Expositor, and Joe and Hiram were both dead. Law was also first counselor in the church presidency at this time, and he was aide-de-camp to the lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion. William Law was a lifelong friend of Emma Hale Smith, then Bideman, right? He remembered this time as a man of nearly 80 years old while he was living in Wisconsin. Now, what he relates of this situation, William Law himself, this comes in the form of 3 letters that were sent by William Law when he responded to allegations of this wife-swapping proposal in Wilhelm Wymetal's 1886 expose. So the expose was published in Utah, and it made the allegations that William Law had tried to basically wife-swap with Joseph Smith here. This is how William Law responds to those allegations. Quote, on page 108, you speak of swapping wives, and state that you have it from one who knows. Now let me say to you that I never heard of it till I read it in your book. Your informant must have been deceived or willfully lied to you. Joseph Smith never proposed anything of the kind to me or to my wife. Both he and Emma knew our sentiments in relation to spiritual wives and polygamy, knew that we were immovably opposed to polygamy in any and every form, that we were so, subsequent events proved. The story may have grown out of the fact that Joseph offered to furnish his wife Emma with a substitute for him, by way of compensation for his neglect of her, on condition that she would forever stop her opposition to polygamy and permit him to enjoy his young wives in peace, and keep some of them in her home, and to be well treated, etc. The great mistake of my life was my having anything to do with Mormonism. I feel it to be a deep disgrace and never speak of it when I can avoid it. For over 40 years, I have been almost entirely silent on the subject and will so continue after this. Accept my kind regards. Signed, William Law. End quote. So William Law, in this denial here, he merely claimed that the allegations of a wife swap proposition between the Laws and the Smiths was patently false. He just blanket denied it. But he did notably carve out the possibility that Emma may have been looking elsewhere than Joseph Smith to satisfy her needs in exchange for no longer hounding Joe about all of his wives. Let me read once again. The story may have grown out of the fact that Joseph offered to furnish his wife Emma with a substitute for him by way of compensation for his neglect of her. Right? So Joe was spending a lot of nights out in other women's beds. So Emma's feeling neglected. She says, I want a spiritual husband to replace, this feeling of neglect. It seems plausible, right? So where does that leave us, right? So this is essentially all of the documentation that we have of William Law and Jane Law with Joseph Smith and Emma Smith, right? So where does that leave us? We have a contemporary antagonistic source making the accusation that Emma and Joe brokered some kind of deal with William and Jane Law. Then we have a late antagonistic reminiscence more than 40 years after the fact, because, once again, William Law was extremely opposed to Mormonism at this time. But that antagonistic reminiscence, that denial of it, was by the accused, and he tried to deny it and expunge his name from any idea of this wife swapping. But then again, he left open the possibility that someone else may have been the subject of such a deal. And then, of course, we have another contemporary source in William Clayton's diary that was recorded at the time it happened in June of 1843 that there was possibly some kind of deal brokered here. So, I mean, it's kind of complicated, right? And then, of course, William Law wrapped up everything that he said by trying to forget any association that he had with Mormonism, claiming that it was the greatest mistake of his life. So Law's letter from 40 years later, taken into the context of the text of 132, which commands Emma to not partake of that which God commanded Joe to offer to Emma, that may exonerate his own name from this accusation of wife swapping, but it far from alleviates any possibility of some kind of swap, possibly with somebody else. With that said, we also have Emma's response to Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith reading her the text of D&C 132. Now, this interaction, this was recorded in William Clayton's journal contemporary with the events, but he gave a detailed affidavit that was in the 1870s, and that affidavit actually provides a lot more detail of this interaction, and it corroborates his brief journal entry for that day. So the relevant piece of his affidavit is as follows, and this goes through the entire creation of the doctrine or of the text of D&C 132, as well as Hiram Smith presenting it to Emma and everything, and the whole thing, how it transpired. So here we go. Quote, "On the morning of the 12th of July, 1843, Joseph and Hiram Smith came into the office in the upper story of the red brick store on the bank of the Mississippi River. They were talking on the subject of plural marriage. Hiram said to Joseph, 'If you will write the revelation on celestial marriage, I will take it and read it to Emma, and I believe I can convince her of its truth, and you will hereafter have its truth, and you will hereafter have peace.' Joseph smiled and remarked, 'You do not know Emma as well as I do.' Hiram repeated his opinion and further remarked, 'The doctrine is so plain, I can convince any reasonable man or woman of its truth, purity, and heavenly origin,' or words to their effect. Joseph then said, 'Well, I will write the revelation, and we will see.' He then requested me to get paper and prepare to write. Hiram very urgently requested Joseph to write the revelation by means of the Urim and Thummim, but Joseph, in reply, said he did not need to, for he knew the revelation perfectly from beginning to end. Hiram then took the revelation to read to Emma. Joseph remained with me in the office until Hiram returned. When he came back, Joseph asked him how he succeeded. Hiram replied that he had never received a more severe talking to in his life, that Emma was very bitter and full of resentment and anger. Joseph quietly remarked, 'I told you you did not know Emma as well as I did.' Joseph then put the revelation in his pocket, and they both left the office." End quote. And that copy of D&C 132, as it later became, the one that Joe put in his pocket, that was the copy that he gave to Emma, and they both consented to have it burned at her wish. But that's okay. Joe said it himself. He knew it from front to back. He could recreate it at any time necessary, and we know that it was recreated and given to Joseph Kingsbury and Newell Whitney, from which Doctrine and Covenants 132 was printed. As a peripheral question, I'll ask, what does it say about Joe that he had his older brother try to convince his wife that polygamy was okay? Why couldn't he do it himself? So, another thing to kind of take into account here, the timing is really quite a bit complicated. So when the revelation was actually dictated, Emma was well aware of her husband spending a lot of time with other women in Nauvoo, right? I mean, seeing the actual revelation in print doesn't seem to explain her angered reaction unless Joe's polygamy was, like a slow rolling boil for her, and then presenting her with the actual text, set her over the edge, turned up the heat too much, and she boiled over, right? But is there something more to the story? Well, what explains her reaction to me is the point in the revelation calling her to cleave to none other than Joseph and condemning her if she didn't consent to the wives that Joe proposed to with, the whole law of Sarah bit that we discussed last episode. According to the text itself, God commanded Joe to broker some kind of deal with Emma, but it was revoked by the text of 132, just like, it used the example of, the commandment of Abraham to kill his son Isaac, right? their deal was just a test for Emma's faithfulness in the words of the Lord, right? So if you're, I mean, what that amounts to is like, if you're in an open relationship, but only one member of that relationship is allowed to have friends with benefits, it's understandable that the other member would be a little mad that they couldn't go get some too, right? So maybe that was what infuriated her, that she had the deal brokered. They had made the deal. She gave the wives, she consented by the law of Sarah, and then Joe reneged on the deal, right? But regardless of what it was that infuriated her specifically, she eventually agreed to Joe taking some young women as wives, assenting to this law of Sarah. And of course, the law of Sarah is contained in the last 8 verses of the Revelation that we went through last episode. So these wives were the Partridge sisters and the Lawrence sisters. And we're about to dive into the details of these relationships with the help of some amazing historians. A detail worth prefacing this information is that Joe had already taken the Partridge sisters, Emily and Eliza, to wife when Emma gave her consent in line with the law of Sarah, but those first marriages were done unbeknownst to Emma. As a result of Emma giving her consent after Joe had already taken Emily and Eliza Partridge to wife, they performed a second ceremony, which was done under Emma's supervision. And the tension during and after that ceremony is palpable, soon to be discussed. Now, where I'm getting a lot of this information is from Newell and Avery's excellent biography of Emma titled Mormon Enigma, and it reconstructs the passage of events expertly. So I'm going to read a fairly large extract from their book with only small bits of editing for continuity here. So where I'm picking up from in this book is it's a bit earlier in the year of 1843, just to add a little bit of context. It begins right after discussing the Eliza Snow staircase incident from sometime in February of 1843. And of course, we discussed that on episode 137, Emma's Stairway to Hell. So if you want to know what I'm talking about there, you go back and listen to that episode. But then after discussing this staircase incident, the book goes on to tell the stories of Eliza and Emily Partridge, and this is largely taken from their own hand. So here we go. Quote, "After Eliza Snow's abrupt departure from Emma's house in February 1843, Joseph apparently resolved to pursue the establishment of plural marriage in spite of Emma's strong feelings. He approached Bishop Edward Partridge's daughters, who had lived for 2 years in his home. Emily was 19 on February 28, 1843. Eliza would be 23 on April 20th. Quote, now this is taken from Emily Partridge. "The first intimation I had from Brother Joseph that there was a pure and holy order of plural marriage," Emily wrote, "was in the spring of 1842, but I was not married until 1843. Emily recorded the events of that year in her reminiscences. "Joseph said to me one day, 'Emily, if you will not betray me, I will tell you something for your benefit.' Of course, I would keep his secret, but no opportunity offered for me some time to say anything to me. He asked me if I would burn it if he would write me a letter. Emily promised to do as he wished. I began to think that was not the proper thing for me to do, and that I was about as miserable as I ever would wish to be for a short time. I went to my room and knelt down and asked my Father in heaven to direct me in the matter. I could not speak to anyone on earth," Emily remembered. "I received no comfort till I went back and watched my opportunity to say I could not take a private letter from him." "Do you wish the matter ended?" he asked. "I do," she replied. But as time passed, Emily wished that she had listened and felt as miserable as she was before. Soon after Emily refused Joseph's letter, she and her sister Eliza received an invitation from Mrs. Elizabeth Durfee. Now, Elizabeth Durfee is a mother in Israel, mother of Israel, I'm not sure what. We're going to discuss that in a second. To spend the afternoon at her home. Emily described this visit, now quoting Emily. "She introduced the subject of spiritual wives, as they called it in that day, and wondered if there was any truth in the report she heard. Emily thought to herself, I could tell her something that would make her eyes open if I chose," meaning that Emily had been taught plural wife, spiritual wifery by Joseph Smith. Elizabeth Durfee called her in to talk to her about it, asking, "Have you heard any of these rumors of spiritual wives?" And Emily thought, I could tell her something that would open her eyes, right? It continues. Not one to be drawn out by gossip, Emily said nothing. But on the way home, she told her sister, that's Eliza, about Joseph's conversation, which disturbed Eliza also. Back to Emily. But it served to prepare her to receive the principles that were revealed soon after, Emily noted. Word that Emily would not betray Joseph was probably carried back to him by Mrs. Durfee. I learned afterward, Emily wrote, that Mrs. Durfee was a friend to plurality and knew all about it, end quote. So let's pause there for a second. Okay, so Mrs. Durfee was one of the mothers of Israel, mothers in Israel. I'm not sure which is the right term. That means that she was somebody who was friendly to the idea of polygamy, and she was actually a woman who would help Joe acquire more younger, and in this case, teenage wives. She, among a few other older plural wives, would meet privately with these younger women, teach them the idea of polygamy, or at least put a bug in their ear about it, and then gauge how receptive they would be to the idea and report their findings to Joseph Smith. Then he would act based upon that information. So like in the case of Nancy Rigdon, he, when he was, accosted with these accusations that he had, proposed to Nancy Rigdon, he denied everything and then he minimized his own actions. But in the case of the Partridge sisters, after Elizabeth Durfee met with them, he knew that they could be trusted. And he set up a meeting in a safe place, which Miss Durfee arranged on behalf of Joe in the home of Heber the Creeper and Violet Kimball. Now, Emily's recounting of the events shows the personal turmoil caused by this controversial proposition that ran counter to everything that she knew both of church doctrine and of her own personal morality. Once again, picking up from Mormon Enigma. Quote, Emily agreed to meet Joseph at Heber Kimball's house in the evening. Some Kimball family members were present when she arrived. Heber explained to her, Violet is not at home, and you had better call at another time. Emily wrote, I started for home as fast as I could so as to get beyond being called back, for I still dreaded the interview between her and Joseph Smith. Then she heard Kimball softly call, Emily, Emily. When he was about to overtake her, she turned and went with him. Now this is what Heber the Creeper Kimball says to her. I cannot tell all Joseph said, but he said, the Lord had commanded me meaning Joseph, to enter into plural marriage and had given me to him. And although I had got badly frightened, he knew I would yet have him. Emily continued, my mind was now prepared and would receive the principles. In a reflective moment, she added, that was the only way it could be done then. Well, I was married, then and there. Joseph went home his way, and I going my way alone. A strange way of getting married, wasn't it? That's her own words. A strange way of getting married, wasn't it? The date was March 4th, 1843. 4 days later, Eliza Partridge married Joseph. She kept a journal, but burned it later because it was, quote, too full, end quote. So this whole interaction, this Elizabeth Durfee setting up the meeting at the Kimball's house, initially meeting with Emily Partridge to ask her if she's heard about these, spiritual wifery rumors, and then communicating that back to Joseph. Joseph having Elizabeth Durfee set up the meeting at the Kimball's house. Emily going to the meeting, saying that she dreaded the interview, all of that, everything. This is all taken from Emily Partridge, right? And that's because Eliza Partridge burned her journal because it was, quote unquote, too full. Too full. I don't think any time in the history of the English language has anybody said so much by saying so little than what was said in those two little words. Too full. Now, these marriages were apparently concealed from Emma, as they occurred 4 months before the revelation was dictated and the possible deal was brokered between Emma and Joe. The consternation that's captured by Newell and Avery here reveals a tendency that was a common thread among most of the women who were married into polygamy in Nauvoo. The thing is, these women became targets of Mormon elites, and once that happened, their paths were laid. They had no more choice in the matter, right? They were forced to shoulder the rumors and drama through none of their own actions. They were given the prophet's secretive burden to bear, and they didn't know who they could or couldn't trust, right? I mean, think on that. Like when Elizabeth Durfee approached Emily to gauge where Emily's mind was on the idea of polygamy, she's 19 at the time, right? Who could she go to? Her dad had died as well. So Emily had no idea that Durfee was actually a mother in Israel and was trying at that very moment to coerce Emily into polygamy. Right? The secrecy must have been a heavy cloud over every initiate's head. Newell and Avery continue to reconstruct the situation so well. I'm just going to let them continue to tell the story. Quote, Emma had heard Joseph and Heber C. Kimball address the Relief Society and allude to a time when women would participate in the endowment. After being involved in the construction and design of the garments, the building of the temple, and hearing about their place in the endowment in the Relief Society, why had women not yet been admitted to the Endowment Council? Heber C. Kimball said it was because some women had led their husbands out of the church. Joseph taught that a man must obey God to be worthy of the endowment, and that a wife must obey a righteous husband to merit the same reward. Of course, because women covenant through their husbands. Luckily, that was changed this year. Until Emma could be obedient to Joseph and give him plural wives, she could not participate in the endowment ceremonies. Yet he taught her that the endowment was essential for exaltation as opposed to salvation, which Joseph taught was available to all through the atonement of Christ. Joseph wanted Emma to serve as the example, the elect lady, disseminator of the endowment blessing to other women. Thus, her rejection of plural marriage would have blocked her admittance into the endowment council because she had not obeyed her husband and therefore prevented other women from entering as well. At the same time that Hiram Smith was struggling with plural marriage, so was Emma. Joseph had apparently been relentless in his efforts to convince her. He was not master in his own home so long as Emma opposed him, and since Emma had discovered his relationship with Eliza Snow, the subterfuge and deception in their lives loomed larger. He wanted Emma to practice plural marriage and to lead forth as the example. It was this setting the example for other women to follow that was most difficult. Continuing from later on. For 2 months, from March to May 1843, Joseph appears to have talked with Emma about plural marriage. He apparently used their rides together to teach her the necessity of the endowment and sealing. There is no evidence that she ever opposed him on any doctrine but plural marriage. Convinced that it was necessary for her salvation and essential to their continued relationship, she may have decided to compromise with Joseph. In May 1843, she finally agreed to give Joseph other wives if she could choose them. Any of Joseph's other wives, who by now numbered at least 16, would have been more comfortable if they had had Emma's approval. Emma chose the 2 sets of sisters then living in her house, Emily and Eliza Partridge and Sarah and Maria Lawrence. Joseph had finally converted Emma to plural marriage, but not so fully that he dared tell her he had married the Partridge sisters 2 months earlier. Emily said that, now quoting Emily, to save family trouble, Brother Joseph thought it best to have another ceremony performed. Emma had her feelings, and so we thought there was no use in saying anything about it so long as she had chosen us herself. Emily also remembered that Emma, quote, helped explain the principles to us, end quote. But apparently Emma choosing the Partridge sisters for Joe wasn't enough, because she also chose the Lawrence sisters. Now we're going to get back to Newell and Avery and Mormon Enigma momentarily, but first an extract about Sarah and Maria Lawrence from Compton's excellent historiography in Sacred Loneliness. This is beginning on page 474. Quote, Zion called, drawing the Lawrences from Canada to Missouri in 1838, but they probably heard of the Mormon War along the way and instead turned eastward to Illinois, settling in Lima, halfway between Commerce, soon to be Nauvoo, and Quincy. Here, Edward, now Edward is Sarah and Maria's father, died in about March 1840, when Maria and Sarah were 17 and 14, leaving a considerable estate for his family to inherit. Under his will, his wife received 1/3 of the inheritance, and the rest was to be split among the heirs. However, a legal guardian was required for the family. Sometime in 1840 or early 1841, the Lawrences moved to Nauvoo. When we next hear of them, they had become part of Joseph Smith's circle, for in June 1841 he was appointed guardian of the minor heirs of Edward Lawrence and trustee for their estate. William Law and Hiram Smith were made bondsmen to Joseph. This guardian relationship is not fully understood, though historian Gordon Madsen has discovered documents that give some insight into its legal complexities. By 1841 or early 1842, Margaret Lawrence, Margaret is Sarah and Maria's mother, had remarried, uniting with Josiah Butterfield, a widower who had been a high counselor in Kirtland and a president of the First Quorum of the Assembly in 1837. Now, if we remember back, Josiah Butterfield was Joe's legal counsel at the beginning of 1843 when he was under arrest and arraigned in the Springfield court. Continuing on. After Butterfield married Margaret, he began consulting with Joseph Smith concerning the Lawrence inheritance. Presumably, the estate could now be transferred to Margaret and Josiah, who would act as Maria and Sarah's guardian. But for unknown reasons, this did not happen. On April 4th, 1842, Joseph's diary reads, quote, transacted business at his house with Josiah Butterfield concerning the Lawrence estate, end quote. 2 months later, on June 4th, Smith, quote, settled with the heirs of Edward Lawrence at his house, Newell K. Whitney and recorder present, end quote. This may reflect payments to the wife and children from the interest of the estate. However, tension began to simmer between Joseph and Josiah Butterfield until on March 28, 1843, it erupted into violence. According to the history of the church, quote, Josiah Butterfield came to my house and insulted me so outrageously that I kicked him out of the house, across the yard, and into the street, end quote. Okay, so what do we make of this so far, right? So we have Sarah and Maria Lawrence, who were at this time in 1843, 17 and 19 years old. Their father had died 3 years previous, and they took board with the Smiths in Nauvoo, probably beginning in mid to late 1841. Now, Edward and Margaret, Sarah and Maria's father and mother, they were quite wealthy. And his will divided up his estate among his wife and children, leaving probably about $18,000 in the names of Sarah and Maria Lawrence. Now, custody in cases like these usually went to men because women could only have custody of their children if they were married. So their mother, Margaret, married a longtime Mormon elite, Josiah Butterfield, who had helped, he had helped Joe push through his writ of habeas corpus in Springfield that we talked about on episodes 137 and on episode 138 with the help of Andrew Torres. But since Joe and Emma were granted legal guardianship of Sarah and Maria Lawrence, the estate was put into their control until Sarah and Maria came of age to use the money and legally hold it. However, when Josiah Butterfield sought a meeting with Joe to get the estate transferred to his and Margaret's names, Joe literally kicked him out of his house and across the street. So after this unpleasant, is that a good word for it? Unpleasant interaction? Joe's Nauvoo journal has a few more entries until his death concerning the Lawrence estate, but very little is actually known of the fate of that money in spite of numerous possibilities. Now, one reasonable way to interpret the record is that the Lawrence money was put into Joe and Emma's hands as they were the legal guardians, right? Joe probably thought that he could use the money for now in order to make some investments, and when the time came to pay that money out, he'd have the money that he made from those other investments to fulfill his duties as guardian and pay the money out to Sarah and Maria Lawrence. But as we know, Joe was always behind the eight ball when it came to money, right? He was on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt at this point. And, a nice smooth 18 grand, that could really have come in handy to relieve some of that pressure, right? So basically what I'm saying is Joe and Emma probably stole that money from Sarah and Maria Lawrence, and then Emma gave her consent for Joe to take them both to wife. This shouldn't be a surprising interpretation of the documentation because Joe screwed everybody with whom he came in contact, right? Unfortunately, no available documentation illuminates the actual fate of that money. But my explanation, my understanding of it falls perfectly within the typical practices of Joe throughout most of his life. Picking up another paragraph from Todd Compton's book, quote, in the midst of this apparent dispute over the estate, Maria and Sarah began living in the Smith household, as were the Partridges, another fatherless pair. In the late spring 1843, Joseph married both Maria, 19, and Sarah, 17, and soon after this he married the Partridge sisters the second time. Emily Partridge wrote, quote, Emma about this time, May, gave her husband 2 other wives, Maria and Sarah Lawrence. This was during the period when Joseph had convinced Emma to permit him to have plural wives on condition that she could choose them, so it is entirely possible that she gave her permission for these marriages, as Emily asserts. Little or nothing further is known of the Lawrence-Smith marriages, end quote. Now, I suppose an interesting question, probably with no real answer, would be, why would Emma choose these two sets of sisters for Joe to take as polygamous wives? Now, we can't actually know that, right? We can just speculate, but the information before us leads to some reasonable possibilities. With the Partridge sisters, right, Emma and Joe had basically become like a second father and mother to the Partridge sisters, right? Joe and Emma had been close friends with their parents for a decade before Edward Partyboy Partridge had died in 1840, when the Partridge girls weren't even teenagers yet, right? That's when they first met. They had even taken Emily and Eliza under their wings and had been caring for them ever since their father's death, which had been for 3 years by 1843. So the Smiths had watched Emily and Eliza grow up from the time before they were even teenagers. They knew the two of them to be good, trustworthy daughters in Zion who could probably keep the secret. Besides, they were already living in the Smith household and spending a lot of time with Emma and Joe, right? So if he was married to them, people would probably think nothing more of seeing Joe with them. Things were as they should be. Now, the same, when it comes to, the Partridge sisters, the same could almost be said about the Lawrence sisters, although the Lawrence family didn't have the same history with Mormonism as the Partridge family did, because the Lawrences had converted in 1837. Regardless, the Lawrences did have a ton of money in their name, and when Joe and Emma were named guardians of the Lawrence sisters, that money came into Joe and Emma's control. Now, if Joe and Emma were bound to the Lawrence sisters through marriage, they may never actually leave the custody or the same household as the Smiths, and possession of that estate and the actual fate of those thousands of dollars may actually never come into question throughout their entire lives, right? So it's kind of complicated why Emma chose these sets of sisters. But it's also worth noting that nobody in Nauvoo was more in tune with Joe's complex web of finances than Emma. And marrying the Lawrence sisters may have alleviated some financial pressures that were continually closing in on the Smiths. I guess all of that kind of leads to this idea that the sectarian or theological justifications may hold some weight for these polygamous marriages for some people. But when you add in the details that Joe and Emma may have picked the Partridge sisters for their convenience and ability to keep a secret, and the Lawrence sisters for the Smiths' own financial gain, those sectarian and theological justifications, all coming from a higher power, they just go right out the window, right? There is no excuse for this. What Joe and Emma did here was simply immoral. And let's always keep this in mind, all of it was a result of Joe's terrible financial situation and his complete inability to be satisfied in a monogamous marriage, in spite of multiple hypocritical statements to the contrary. Now, regardless of the reasoning behind these choices, Emma apparently gave her consent to these marriages, coming into accordance with the law of Sarah. But all was not well. The tensions were felt immediately after the ceremonies were performed, and they only escalated from that time forward. So back to Newell and Avery's biography of Emma Smith, Mormon Enigma, quote, Emma's capitulation to these marriages, however, was only momentary. Emily wrote that, now quoting Emily, Emma seemed to feel well until the ceremony was over, when almost before she could draw a second breath, she turned and was more bitter in her feelings than ever before, if possible. And before the day was over, she turned around or repented what she had done and kept Joseph up till very late in the night talking to him. Back to Newell and Avery. Understandably, Emily and Eliza, whose marriages Emma had sanctioned one moment and disapproved the next, had feelings of their own. Back to Emily. She had, as it were, bound us to the ship and carried us to mid-ocean, then threw us overboard to sink or swim, as the case might be. End quote. And, of course, in case somebody wants to make the case that these marriages somehow didn't include all aspects of typical marriages, I'm going to quote again from Mormon Enigma. Quote, William Clayton's diary entry for the same day explains why Emma was angry. Joseph told Clayton that he, quote, had had a little trouble with Sister Emma. He had been with Eliza Partridge in an upstairs room when he heard someone on the stairs and quickly shut the door. Not knowing who it was and held it, Emma came to the door and called Eliza 4 times and tried to force open the door. President Smith opened it and told her the cause, etc. She seemed much irritated. That's from William Clayton, of course. Now, William Clayton, he saw everything. He saw everything. He knew everything that happened. Why would Joseph have held the door until Emma had called Eliza Partridge's name 4 times? Did Emma believe that Joseph and Eliza were hiding something from her? Emily remembered that Emma, quote, kept close watch on us. If we were missing for a few minutes and Joseph was not at home, the house was searched from top to bottom and from one end to the other. And if we were not found, the neighborhood was searched until we were found. Back to Newell and Avery. Emma was not successful in keeping Joseph from meeting with his wives. Emily Partridge would one day testify under oath that she, quote, roomed, end quote, with Joseph on the night of her second marriage to him, while Emma, she believed, was in the house at the time. She also testified that she had, quote unquote, slept with him between her first marriage and the second ceremony, end quote. I guess there's a lot of information floating out here. Emma's thoughts and beliefs and feelings on polygamy after Joe's death leave absolutely no uncertainty that she hated the very idea of it. But that's understandable, right? Polygamy had caused Emma so much trouble throughout her life. It fueled the persecution that the Mormons had experienced, and it ultimately led to the deaths of her husband and one of her closest friends, Hiram. In 1843, she had no idea what the future held, right? She was acting on impulse and what she could best perceive of her given situation at the time. But Joe had a long history of stepping out on her, and she probably knew that he could never be stopped, right? But if she could approve of the wives that he took, and they were mainly women who were already living with the Smiths, she could exercise at least the smallest modicum of control over a situation that she was ultimately powerless to stop. So her reluctant acceptance of polygamy would sometimes go so far as to guard the door of a room that Joe and one of his teenage wives were held up in, according to Emily Partridge, of course, to deter any interested observers. Other times, she was staunchly against polygamy and her husband having teenage wives, and that's understandable as well. But the thing is, she was forced to operate under the doctrine of appeasement to keep from conflict. And Emma was widely known as an inherently non-confrontational person, a general people pleaser, if you'd like to call it. But what else could she do? The reputation of her husband and her own self lay in the balance if the rumors of polygamy became anything more than just rumors, right? She couldn't stop Joe, but she could cover for him to help it from being exposed and embarrassing her and Joseph Smith and completely and utterly destroying any semblance of her old life. But the thing is, she didn't know what would happen. Joe didn't know what would happen. Nobody had any idea what the future held should Joe go public with polygamy. The entirety of Emma's interactions with Nauvoo polygamy, they strike me as somebody who's biding their time when they don't have any options or solutions, like a Skylar White kind of figure, right? I mean, the thing is, Emma did have options and solutions, but the consequences of those were probably just too great to overcome. Right, the Nauvoo Emma strikes me as somebody who was overcome with feelings of both grief and relief when Joe was finally killed. That's probably an unpopular opinion, but just consider her plight and the possible consequences if she tried to change the hand that she was dealt. Joseph Smith had everything in Nauvoo in his control. He had women coercing other younger women to become his wives. People were killed for not paying their tithing in Nauvoo. He had a massive network of spies, and nothing happened in Nauvoo without his knowledge. The legal system had repeatedly proven itself completely impotent in trying to curtail his growing power, and he had politicians by the dozen either in his pockets or filling the pews of his church. He was probably one of the wealthiest men living in Illinois at the time, even if every one of his assets had liens on it. The thing is, the counterfeit business provided plenty of liquid money for him to live his preferred hard and fast life. He had an army in his control and an underground militia that lived in the shadows of night. Every street had a young man whittling wood with a Bowie knife, watching everything that happened in the city and funneling all that information right back to their commander-in-chief. Anybody who opposed Joseph Smith wound up with either their character or their life assassinated. Even with all of these descriptions I provided, words fail me in aptly describing how powerful and terrifying Joseph Smith truly was at this time. What could Emma do? I mean, what were her options? What were the consequences of those options? Could she divorce him? I mean, he'd destroy her character and she'd never recover. What would the kids think, right? What would happen with her kids at that time? If they got divorced, then the kids would be transferred to Joseph Smith's custody. Could she trust him raising her kids? I mean, could she go public with the accusation of polygamy and then sue Joe for divorce on grounds of adultery? Once again, her kids would be forfeit in the proceedings. I mean, also worth considering is, where would the average everyday Mormon come down on this massively public battle should it happen? Right? I mean, there are more than 10,000 people who believe that everything that falls out of Joseph Smith's mouth is the word of God. Are they going to side with him or the elect lady turned divorcee in this public battle? I mean, what could she do? Well, could she poison him and her problems would be solved? Possibly, but from who would she procure the poison? How could she effect such a plan without Joe noticing? Right? Could she organize a coup and maybe have him assassinated? There'd be absolutely no way to make that happen without Joe finding out and exacting some form of punishment or revenge. Could she plead to the governor to have her husband arrested? Well, the problem is she repeatedly pled to both Governor Carlin and Governor Ford to have her husband released from prison on multiple occasions. Why would they believe her? Why would they act on her word to now have him arrested? I mean, what reasonable expectation did she have of them being successful in any kind of government action to bring Joe in and actually get him sent to prison or the gallows? And, you know, at the end of the day, she probably still loved him. And she probably didn't want to see him go through any of that. You see, we have to look back and wonder, how could Emma possibly sign off on Joe taking teenage wives that were living under her own roof? I would ask, given the circumstances, how could she not sign off? How could she do anything other than just pacify and appease without her life being threatened? Her life or her livelihood. Her way of life. Everything hung in the balance. You see, Emma couldn't break the system. The system was too robust. Joe had his finger on every control. So she played the game by Joe's rules until it was over. That's when she could make her own rules. That does it for our episode today. I am so excited to announce something to all of you. I don't know how many of you do or do not listen to The Scathing Atheist. It's, you know, a fantastic podcast on all atheist and skeptic news. They've gone through their gamut of reading through holy books. They read first through the Bible and just, you know, did funny skits and talked about it, summarized it, made fun of it. Then they read through the Quran, did the same thing, read through the Book of Mormon, did the same thing. And now, I can't believe I'm telling you this, they decided to dive into the Pearl of Great Price. Now, the Pearl of Great Price, if you don't know anything about it, it's just basically an appendix or multiple appendices to Mormon scripture. It's one of the 4 holy books that Mormonism holds to. I assume that most people listening to this are aware of that or grew up, you know, toting around that book in their triplet or their quad every Sunday and to seminary every day of the week. But if not, it's really a fun book. It's super short and real fun to listen to. So Scathing Atheist, for the next, you know, who knows how long, they're going to be reading through the Pearl of Great Price. Noah was nice enough to invite me on to episode 320, which just aired this week. of The Scathing Atheist and had me just kind of introduce it to the listeners and to him, let everybody know kind of a bit of a precursor of where the books came from that are included in it, what they can expect, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So if you check the show notes, you'll find a link to episode 320 of The Scathing Atheist, where you can listen to the guest spot that I was on for that. It's probably going to start around the 35 to 40 minute range. Of course, a couple of other announcements that are coming up here. I have a couple of engagements that are happening, speaking engagements. So coming up on April 14th, now that's just 10 days away from when this airs, I'm going to be down in the St. George area, room at the Square, giving a public speech there. It is free to admittance. It's going to be at 175 West, 900 South in St. George, Utah, beginning at 2 p.m. That is on Sunday, April 14th. Now, I'm going to give a brief rundown of just kind of my coming to skepticism moment, how I got interested into Mormon history and religious studies and whatnot, and as well as I'm going to share a bit of my newest research on the Smith-Entheogen theory, which I think is going to be quite interesting, and it's something that I don't think a whole lot of people are aware of. So that should be a really cool speaking engagement. There's a local Mormon, ex-Mormon meetup group that is organizing it. Once again, that's going to be at 175 West, 900 South, room at the Square in St. George, Utah, April 14th at 2 p.m. Also, Sunstone is coming up. That's going to be April 26th in the Short Creek area. Short Creek is the twin cities of Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. I cannot speak for some reason today. Please bear with me. That's going to be, the actual Sunstone is just a one-day event, but there's going to be events all the weekend long from the 26th to the 28th. So if you can make it down to the Short Creek area, there's going to be a really awesome panel of speakers there. They have the program up on sunstonemagazine.com. You can find a link to it in the show notes for the actual Sunstone in Short Creek event that will be coming up here in another, at the end of this month. If you want to go to that, you got to get tickets, get them online. I think you can get tickets at the door as well if you just show up to Short Creek. Obviously, accommodations are, not what you would expect. It's not near an airport or anything, but if you're in the Utah area, specifically the southwestern area of Utah, it'd be really cool to see you down there, and I'm going to be doing interviews for most of the day. We're going to have a special room set up, and as it's set right now, we're going to have Colleen Dietz of Mormon Happy Hour podcast there to hang out with us, and I'm going to be doing, interviews of people that are there. Sorry, we're going to be doing interviews of people that will be there. Some of the people who are presenting, some historians who will be showing up. It's really going to be a lot of fun, and Sunstone always is a lot of fun, so it'd be really cool to see you there. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our newest patrons. They are over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. We have a new pledge by Chris, pledge by Donald Bright. I bet you are Bright, Donald, because you're a patron of the show. Of course you are. Then we also have a pledge edit by Cass. So to all of our patrons, to the new pledges, to the pledge edit, thank you so much for supporting the show. What your money does is gets me to these speaking engagements. It gets me around the country to go to these history conferences so that I can bring really awesome content back to you. You are investing into my career. I don't know how else to say that, because that's exactly what that is. And for that, I dearly and deeply thank you, all of you, for pledging to support over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And my way of thanking you for that is by giving you a bunch of extra content, because if you can't get enough of me talking at you, you can find a whole bunch of extra content over on the Patreon feed. And of course, for all of the listeners, for everybody who hits the download button, I want to thank you so much for listening and for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.